So as I said, today's portion of Chitas being from the Shlishi portion, it has within it the discussion of the tzitz, which is the forehead plate, and that forehead plate has 3 cords which are associated with it. But more importantly, we have on that headband we have some words which the verse says. So we're talking about the text of Chumash, the book of Shemos, the book of Exodus, chapter 28, verse 36 and 37, and it says, the verse says, "You shall make a pure gold headband and engrave on it with a writing of the type of a signet ring," so engraved, and it should say, "Holy for the eternal, Kodesh LaHashem." Rashi, the great commentator in relationship to that, tells us that the headband is a type of golden plate. It's got a 2-finger breadth width and extends across the forehead from ear to ear. Okay, so that's what we're told about it and where it's positioned. Now, in relationship to what's written over there, and for anybody who was looking, we saw a picture, and it's that top picture over there. Now, in relationship to that, we have a very interesting discussion within the Talmud, that this tzitz, this headband, was a golden plate, and the Torah commands about that it has to have the words Kodesh LaHashem there, and then the Talmud records a discussion about it, and it says on that headband it's written in 2 lines. God's 4-letter name is written above, and Kodesh and Lamed, the idea of sacred too, is below it. And then in relationship to that, we have testimony that one of our great sages, after the sacking of the temple and the vestments were stolen, and taken to the conquerors, which was the Romans, he said, when I went to the Romans and I went to the Caesar's palace and I saw his treasury, and so it's quoted in the Talmud that Rabbi Eliezer, son of Rabbi Yose, said, "I actually saw it. I physically saw in the Caesar's treasury in the city of Rome, and I saw that in fact it was written on 1 line." So the Talmud in Tractate Shabbos 63b says that and talks about how these people went there and they got to see this. They got to see this. So Rashi has told us, as we said, that it's that there's a type of golden plate 2 finger bits width. Why does it need to be the 2 finger handprints width? It needs to be able to have space enough to write those words in the 2 lines. But more interestingly, we find that it is understood by Maimonides, the greatest of our ones who rules, that Rambam rules in accordance with the sages who had the first opinion. That is, that forehead plate, as per the picture, had 2 lines on it. But he writes in the Rambam writes in his description of the rules for the Beis HaMikdash that he accords with Rabbi Eliezer's opinion as well by saying that if the words were written on 1 line, it is also valid. And there are times when they are actually written in 1 line. So from that we understand that it's allowed to be written on one line, but it was written on 2 lines. So our issue has to be, we can understand how is it that the sages who actually told us what the rules are ignore Rabbi Eliezer's eyewitness testimony? Surely they didn't think he wasn't telling the truth regarding what he actually saw. So as we say, seeing is believing, and seeing is and we actually see something done in practice. So we have a general rule that sometimes when, although there might be discussions about the rabbis about how something is done, if we actually see our teacher, our mentor, our rabbi actually doing it a particular way, so we know that that's the preferred opinion. So here we know Rabbi Eliezer has given eyewitness testimony that it was actually written in 1 line. So how is it that the rabbis saw fit to describe it as on 2 lines? Or why do we actually come to that opinion? And the Rambam seems to incorporate both opinions to be able to do it done in 2 lines, but if it's okay if it's done in 1 line. So how could that be? So it's an interesting aspect. We know that there's a discussion in relationship to the shape of the menorah. We know, and it's been discussed a lot in the literature, right? That we've seen architectural, or we've seen historical, or we've seen engravings. We find archaeological evidence, what we call evidence that the menorah the branches of the menorah go out in a round fashion around the menorah. So we've seen many things like that. However, we find that the Rambam, and we find explicitly written. We have copies of his handwritten commentaries, discussions. That it's actually the lines which came out from the menorah are straight, and part of the discussion which relates to that is that the menorah itself, we know, was actually had the arms which came out from them were actually straight. The curved versions are a discrepancy that that there's a lot of discussion about. How do we reconcile the idea of the menorah that even though officially it's supposed to be straight hands and it's curved? So there are some conjecture, but one of the conjectures is that since the menorah was a preferred and revered symbol amongst the Jews, and people didn't want to necessarily copy exactly what was in the Beis HaMikdash because that might be considered somewhat potentially profane, but people made replicas of it. So these replica menorahs were common enough that the artists in Rome and other places copied these replicas. We also know that in the Beis HaMikdash they had menorahs used actually for lighting purposes. They weren't necessarily the holy menorah, but they were in the similar shape of the menorah. So in relationship to the tzitz forehead, to the breastplate forehead, perhaps we can have a similar explanation. Perhaps there's the explanation can be provided for that way. Rabbi Eliezer might have seen a copied version or an inexact replica of the plate in Rome that had the words engraved on it in just 1 line. The sages, however, had a tradition passed on from their teachers that the historical tzitz was actually engraved on 2 lines. Rabbi Eliezer's testimony was not strong enough to persuade them because they had a tradition, as we say that the tradition handed down from one set of sages from one age and the other age of how it's supposed to be, even though how you can have it is allowed, but what they have cast no doubt to the rabbis that it was actually on 2 lines, but the version that he saw might have been a replica. So what Rabbi Eliezer saw in Rome must have been some sort of mistaken one. However, Rabbi Eliezer himself presumably didn't have a tradition regarding the plates engraving. Therefore, he had no reason to mistrust what he actually seen with his own eyes. But without an opposing tradition, he could accept that what he had seen represented a actual true historical forehead plate used in the Beis Hamikdash, and hence the Rambam said you can either. However, the Rambam rules that the one-line tzitz is acceptable, and that it actually exists at some time. And in order to avoid multiplying arguments between the sages, Rambam reasoned that Rabbi Eliezer's position was reliable enough, but not necessarily the most optimal. And in fact, because one-line plate was seldom used, that may be how the incorrect version was replicated in Rome. So perhaps an observer had seen this rarer one-line engraving, leading to replicas of it in Rome itself. In general, so this whole idea of seeing is believing as opposed to tradition, right? This has a relevance to us because we've found different manuscripts and different versions of things which have been somewhat different from variations from our tradition. But it's prudent to recall that not every manuscript that find actually records the historical truths, because in fact, if they were dug up and found in some sort of Geniza somewhere, some hidden, it could be that there was put into Geniza, into the hidden areas, into the places where they were hidden, and that could be because these had changed from the traditions that we had, and perhaps that's the very reason why they were buried and discarded, because they weren't always as relevant. And what we do have as a positive, as a for sure, is that we have a tradition from father to son and from our sage to a sage, and therefore we can be verified that this tradition, which has been handed down through all the generations, has validity. And so similarly with the tzitz that was and how it was made.